African Americans began moving in large numbers to the Los Angeles environs in the decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century, joining communities of whites and Jews, Chinese and Japanese, old Californios, and new Mexican immigrants, as well as immigrants of other backgrounds. The majority of the new Black migrants relocated from American southern states, and like those who moved to the northeastern part of the US, African Americans moving to California and other western parts also acted to escape the worst of Jim Crow anti-Black racist restrictions. Similar to others who moved to the state, African Americans embraced the booster promoted California dream of a leisure lifestyle in picturesque outdoor settings and new life opportunities, even while discrimination and lax enforcement of California civil rights laws that were implemented as early as 1893 for decades into the 20th century prevented them from using various public and private facilities and buying land in many areas. My new book, Living the California Dream, African American Leisure Sites During the Jim Crow Era, which I'm going to be speaking about today, explores how African Americans made their California and how African Americans made California and American history by challenging racial and class structures when they occupied recreational and recreational sites and public spaces at the core of the state's formative mid-20th century identity. These sites became contested ground in the development of attractive inland resorts and beach areas relatively free from white citizens' harassment. In Los Angeles, recreation and relaxation were essential components of liberty and distinctive civil rights concerns in the nation's long freedom rights struggle. I will also share some ways I, as a historian, have joined with others in using a few of these stories to engage audiences in history as well as heritage and nature conservation and social and environmental justice education, in some places more successfully than others. I offer a view of overlooked and erased extraordinary community builders and socioeconomic development experiences of the Black middle class and the impact of leisure that intersects with the new scholarship about the influence of the diverse output of the Harlem Renaissance and the new Negro experience as a cultural movement of national and global phenomena. These stories of economic development initiative and civil rights struggle add new information and understanding about how African Americans sought to seize their California and American dream to appropriate and shape the offerings of their new environment in the far West. As the Reverend Darius Stokes quote alludes to here, the search for the American dream in real and mythologized opportunities offered by the California dream transcends time and ethnicity from the colonial period to the 20th century. When the American and Western ideals and mythologies are combined with the romanticized California Spanish and Mexican heritage, the region's beautiful landscape and its warm climate, a reputation for tolerance and inclusiveness, and the pioneering spirit, the fully developed California dream emerges. These stories I have reconstructed, recast the significance, meaning, and place of leisure by recognizing African Americans' leadership and action therefore giving a more complex understanding of the American experience in the West and California, where racial discrimination existed in practice rather than legally, as in many other states of the nation in the post-enslavement modern capitalist era. In contrast to the city where Black Angelinos lived, California waterfront and pastoral inland places where they went to relax and invested in real estate included in Los Angeles County, Bruce's Beach, in Manhattan Beach, Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach, sometimes controversially called the Inkwell, and Eureka Villa in North Los Angeles County in the Santa Clarita Valley area. Riverside's Lake Elsinore and Corona's Parkridge Country Club are a few other places around Southern California are also included in my study. The stories of California's largest and most popular, though not broadly remembered, African-American leisure destinations were sites of pleasure, civil rights struggle and contestation, and economic development that flourished for different time durations between the 1900s to the 1960s. These are the stories of public and private memories of African Americans of all socioeconomic classes. The new Negro who migrated out of the U.S. South to the north, to northern, Midwestern, and far Western cities in the post-World War I decades to escape racial injustice. These migrants were more self-confident and sometimes militant in demanding their rights as citizens and as consumers. The consumption of leisure as a particular lifestyle and a performance vehicle of various social practices to gain fulfillment, self-determination, and uplift became a new forceful marker in the claim of middle-class status, place, and American citizenship and culture that spread from California to the rest of the United States beginning early in the 20th century. Race, power, privilege, and wealth often influence leisure opportunities, just as these factors determined who was able to take advantage of economic and social opportunities in California. Even with these impacts, African-American leisure builders and seekers, through creative assertion, claimed and performed full social and civic membership along with social and economic resourcefulness. As Californians undertook leisure, many found it restricted, and sometimes they found themselves excluded from the way of life. White boosters broadcasted this rhetoric, white boosters broadcasted this rhetorical and imaginary about leisure lifestyles, about leisure lifestyle pleasures as a message in mass media, speaking to white consumers to create a sense of place in California, in the California social and physical landscape that excluded Jews and people of color. In the white boosters' messages, communities of color were situated as laborers, if at all, rather than neighbors and social equals. This history is layered with stories about group and individual circumstances and chronicles about migration patterns, socioeconomic status, cultural practices, and education and employment opportunities, and social power. These intersecting and overlapping experiences and stories took place in private and public spaces. They are inseparable from one another in their composition and reflection of the structural, racial exclusion and class exploitation imposed on African Americans and other people of color. As Afro-Californians embraced the booster dream of a leisure lifestyle, at the same time, they contested attempts at what the California Eagle newspaper identified as confinement to sordid forms of recreation and play to assert self-determination in leisure. Astute African-American entrepreneurs and civic builders in Southern California and around the nation recognized how this embrace of leisure combined with real estate and other business opportunities could create income, wealth, and joy for themselves and visitors. Social networking and community building, as well as cultural traditions and economic development of African Americans around leisure pursuits occurred at these sites, marking a space of Black identity on the regional landscape and social space. Unwilling to accept exclusion, Black Angelenos, like their counterparts in other places, developed separate leisure spaces for emotional and physical rejuvenation to circumvent the oppressive racist subjugation of the era and to promote a renewed sense of racial pride, cultural self-expression, economic independence, and a mix of progressive political perspectives that were the embodiment of the new Negro determined to achieve a fuller participation in American society. These experiences and memories of these leisure spaces and destinations and the attention they gained in public memory and newspapers of the era offered African Americans new and broader visions of themselves, a new identity, and a new collective sense of freedom, contributing to cultural and intellectual efforts that define the new Negro. In California, African Americans' ambitions and initiatives for leisure space also radically claimed, challenged, and promoted the state's identity in the consumption of leisure as a lifestyle that would spread across the country to develop a new suburban middle-class culture. Black Angelenos transgressed social spaces as they asserted self-determination to participate in popular leisure and resort cultural, social, economic trends that were considered modern by the 1920s. In ex-urban communities, African Americans bought property so they could control their enjoyment of these activities and contest white racism. Particularly, they were challenging whites' prejudice and power in the labeling of African Americans as laborers and as inferior. In the context of the changing US culture, along with the aspirational discourse of the California dream, the Los Angeles community formation, and centrality of the California lifestyle ideal and its influence on the nation, African American consumers developed and consumed leisure in specific California geographic environments. Each site has its own history of development of leisure of a specific sort in social, political, and economic particulars, as well as racialized issues of the time and place. One of the earliest places African Americans went for recreation and relaxation was Lake Elsinore in Riverside County, a somewhat successful residential and leisure destination for the general population and African Americans through the middle decades of the 20th century. This was one of the furthest inland of the African American leisure spaces that existed from the 1910s to 1960s. The vagaries of the lake condition and changing leisure tastes and race relation dynamics over the years impacted African American entrepreneurs' resort business opportunities and success. The African American presence has been left out of the local history narratives and landmark designation programming to obscure our understanding of the full shared collective history of the range of community builders and their impact and contributions to the development of Lake Elsinore and the Southern California region. The Parkridge Country Club in Corona in Riverside County was a private elite club and leisure space development originally built for white-only clientele. A group of very ambitious African-American businessmen, Journey White, who I showed a picture of earlier, Dr. Eugene Nelson, who I also showed a picture of earlier, and Clarence Bailey, purchased the site to operate as an interracial recreation space and as an attempt at Black community suburbanization and elite recreation in 1927. The local elite and other white racist citizens strongly contested the African American reconstruction of this venture in the Corona community. The Black businessmen's efforts to make the venture a success have been left out of the local history narrative and public memory, and thereby limiting, again, our understanding of what the Corona community's historical actors, who the Corona community's historical actors were, and how the city evolved. Eureka Villa, later known as Valverde in the Santa Clarita Valley area of North Los Angeles County, was initially an African-American planned resort community development project with white business partners that began in 1924. An early leader of this project was Black Angelino real estate impresario and booster, Sidney P. Dones. At the same time this resort enterprise was emerging, there were other land development projects in direct competition with Eureka Villa for African American recreation and relaxation, patronage, and dollars. Public money contributed to the development of a park and a swimming pool, and multiple marketing efforts by boosters, both Black and white, helped sustain the interest of the African American consumers' usage of this Hidden Canyon area until the crumbling of the racial apartheid era in the 1960s. By 2015, the Valverde community had been recast as one of the last rural areas remaining with affordable housing in the Santa Clarita Valley, with limited public memory of the African American heritage. So I'm going to talk a bit more in terms of giving you information about the African American experience at the last two beach sites in Manhattan Beach and Santa Monica. So all will have a little more context and understanding the uses and implications of reconstructing this broader history for contemporary civic pride and community engagement activities. Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, a Pacific Rim community in southwestern Los Angeles County, was an early successful African American residential resort and leisure destination, which opened in 1912. The town was just forming at that time. It had just gotten its name, and Black Californian pioneers, Willa and Charles Bruce, purchased land there to build a resort business. And at the same time, a small surrounding oceanfront African-American residential community developed. Eventually, racial exclusionary measures aided by destructive use of state power in 1924 eliminated their residential and economic development with attempts to erase the site's memory from history. Only through political assertion has a limited revival of the history of Bruce's Beach and its incorporation into the public record emerged in the first decades of the 21st century. The Bruce's community and its visitors were not alone in facing legal sanctions and private harassment actions discouraging African Americans from visiting and settling in particular beach locales as the region's population increased during the 1920s. During this decade, several Save the Beach campaigns were implemented to keep African Americans from creating or maintaining beachfront resorts. I discuss in the book several other of these exclusionary actions against African Americans that occurred in other California beach towns in the 1920s. There were confrontations and assaults across decades, some of which turned violent, aimed to bar African Americans from public beaches. The most coveted California recreation and relaxation destination then and now. Activists mounted legal challenges to these discriminatory practices endeavored by whites throughout this time period, from the early 20th century all the way into the 60s. And you could argue even today. Even with such white violence and attempts to evict African Americans from public beach space at various places along the Southern California coast, this community's days of recreation and relaxation occurred unabated. African Americans were publicly mindful in their oceanfront. They were discreetly publicly mindful in their oceanfront visits, but undeterred by white Americans' attempts to harass, molest, intimidate, or restrict them from California public beaches. In their first organized civil disobedience action in the region, members of the Los Angeles branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1927 challenged Manhattan Beach officials when they tried additional measures to make the beach white only. Although the Bruce's Beach community was raised when NAACP members staged a swim-in protest for which they were arrested and fined, through legal maneuvers, clarification was won that African Americans had the legal right to enjoy this and all California beaches. In the coming decades, with this accomplishment, African Americans' more confident assertion of their legal rights contributed to racial restriction attempts by whites at the state's public beaches fading away. As the 20th century advanced, African Americans around the US would increasingly utilize legal actions and public protests to dismantle legally sanctioned, along with informally enforced discrimination and segregation in public accommodations. Eventually, in 1956, out of fear of the legal consequences of the past inaction by local Manhattan Beach officials, the vacant terrain once enjoyed by African Americans was transformed into a public park. After various waves of local citizens' sometimes contentious public discussion about their municipality's heritage over many years, in 2007, the site not officially known as Bruce's Beach was formally commemorated by Manhattan Beach City leaders and citizens with this Pacific Oceanfront Park site renamed in its honor, and a descriptive text plaque with gross inaccuracies 80 years after the Black resort community was removed and razed. The public commemoration opened up broader claims for not just public memory, but also American identity, even with the signage text that dilutes, misrepresents, and partially omits the site's historical truths and understanding. Fast forward to 2020, new energy has arisen to reclaim the important history of the Black-owned beach resort at a site, making this site a place of consciousness, reflection, healing, and pilgrimage at a time when racial inequalities have been laid bare by the long history of injustice that has led to the death of several African Americans and other people of color. Bruce's Beach has been the event site of a memorial for Breonna Taylor, the young emergency medical technician in Kentucky that was shot dead in her home by police officers executing a drug warrant at the wrong place in March. Also, the site has been a celebration space of Father's Day and Juneteenth, which was June 19th, the day enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas, learned they had been free 2 years before the end of the Civil War, after President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. These events were held at the Bruce's Beach site to show solidarity with nationwide protests against systematic anti-Black racism and gratuitous police brutality and murders, which the Black Lives Matter movement has forced prominently onto the national and world agenda as part of a reclamation of and commitment to the Black freedom struggle. Joining the current national movement around social initiatives to address anti-Black racism, Manhattan Beach city officials and citizens have formed a task force to develop a plan and a timetable to accurately revise and illuminate the Bruce's Beach history on the park signage and develop other related public education programs. Santa Monica's Bay Street Beach also has been a site of memorial events to celebrate the lives of George Floyd, a man who was killed during an arrest by a white officer who knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 8 minutes in Minnesota in May, and also for Breonna Taylor. The surfing community held paddle outs to call attention to the social injustice issues of the day. These events were held by different groups. Each of these events had hundreds of people that participated in the Hawaiian burial ritual of a paddle out on boards, going out past the surf breaks to form a circle, and they splash water and they toss flowers, and these are symbols to honor. These were symbols to honor Floyd and others who have died. At one of the events, one of the events was part of a worldwide event that took place from California to Texas to New York to France to Senegal and to Australia. An organizer of this event expressed her ambitious goal was to get the predominantly white Southern California surfing community involved with social justice. I joined her in hoping that the activities that went on back in May and June, like this, like the paddle outs for social justice, will increase awareness and constructive anti-racism actions. African Americans were able to build a sustained community in the city of Santa Monica, founded in the environs of the Bay Street Beach in what is today the southern area of the Civic Center and Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, the first African American church established in the city. A short way south was a Venice community, which was also, or a Venice neighborhood of African Americans, which was also part of the Santa Monica African American community. In the years surrounding Phillips Chapel's beginnings in 1908 at 4th and Bay Streets, the oceanfront area down the hill emerged as a gathering place where African Americans from all over Los Angeles County and beyond came to enjoy the beach's pleasures. And probably when Bruce's Beach was forced to close in the middle of the 1920s, that encouraged even more people to go to the Santa Monica Beach. While the boundaries shifted through time, it was a popular beach destination for African Americans from the 1900s to the 1960s. Many of the beachgoers once referenced this stretch of coastline as the Bay Street Beach. There were some other people who called it the Inkwell. The latter name was most certainly derogatory and first used by whites, referencing the skin color of the beachgoers. Some African Americans reclaimed the name and used it as a badge of pride. Some who went to this beach never used the name for the place, and in contemporary times, there are people who still would prefer the name not be used. Accessible by streetcar near a thriving African American community centered around Phillips Chapel and a few Black-owned businesses, this beach gathering place with the Black business of La Bonita, a guest house and a cafe, and a few other establishments of this sort, eating places, some tennis courts, volleyball nets, and other recreational opportunities, this area became a place of refuge and community formation. In 1922, a group of African American investors led by attorney Charles S. Darden, who was also a resort developer at Lake Elsinore, and businessman Norman O. Houston, who would go on to become a founder of the Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company and other businesses, sought to develop a first-class resort along the ocean front at Pico Boulevard. The plan was met with protests from white businessmen and residents. Santa Monica racist white city officials and others blocked the development from happening. After the Black investment group abandoned its plans, the property was purchased by white developers. The white group's plans for resorts were approved, and the iconic Casa del Mar, now the iconic Club Casa del Mar, now a hotel, and another beach club, the Edgewater, now the hotel shutters on the beach, were built before 1930. Even with this and other new construction, African Americans kept their hold on this public beach space, though they were pushed further south. They were able to avoid overtly physical hostile discrimination as the area evolved from the edge to the center of public activity. While racial discrimination, in particular, racist restrictive covenants prevented African Americans from buying property throughout the urban region, and their beach service businesses were sabotaged by white supremacist actions more than once in the first half of the 20th century. Their community's presence and agency sustained their public usage at the oceanfront in Santa Monica. This and other Southern California leisure spaces marked an African American identity on the regional landscape and social space as they confronted the emergent power politics of leisure space and set the stage for these sites as places for remembrance and invention and remembrance of invention and public contest. The city of Santa Monica's 2005 landmark designation of Phillips Chapel Christian Methodist Episcopal Church set the stage in 2008 for the official recognition with a cultural monument of the official recognition of the historical African American beach gathering place at Bay Street and Oceanfront Walk with a cultural monument. And Nick Gabaldon was also recognized, the first documented surfer of African American and Mexican American descent in the Santa Monica Bay. Gabaldon and other African Americans' actions to use this and other beaches embody the local stories that contribute to the national narrative of mass movement to open leisure space to all, demonstrating how the struggle for leisure and public space, along with political and economic issues, reshaped the long freedom rights struggle and civil rights movement. Fast forward to 2019, this same beach was honored with a listing as the Bay Street Beach Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places by the National Park Service for its significance in the American experience in US history. This is the first historic district in Santa Monica to receive this national honor. At Recreation and relaxation space targeted at African Americans, they proved this racism of the region more readily contestable than elsewhere in the country. At Bay Street, the landmark designations infuses a cultural and natural resource site with complexities of human history and experiences, offering a critical dimension beyond beauty, rarity, and environmental protection, which strengthens objectives of both the heritage and nature conservation movements. For a social, from a social and environmental justice standpoint, the inclusion of this history is symbolic of important limited social change which has occurred. Landmarking of this Santa Monica site pushes forth a sense of collective cultural belonging and common membership in American society that helps in forming a basis for social progress and action in the future. As a public historian, I have led coordination to facilitate remembrance of African American voices at Santa Monica's historic sites through the development of innovative public programming partnerships between the Santa Monica Conservancy, Heal the Bay, the Black Surfers Collective, and other groups. The benefits of ongoing investment in pluralistic heritage and nature education through these partnerships is important to continue building future pathways to new, wider, and younger audiences, as well as established audiences in support of heritage and nature conservation ideals. This programming, such as Nick Gabaldon Day, International Coastal Cleanup Day, and field trips for youngsters from inland areas, actively connects diverse publics to more complex, culturally inclusive stories of our collective national history and social, our collective national history. It connects to social action, beach access issues, ocean life and watershed stewardship intersecting with beach recreation. The nature conservation movement's engagement of broader, more culturally inclusive audiences is enhanced by developing the cultural and historical heritage of natural sites, such as the ones I discussed today, to reach specific audiences and align with community values. Supporters of both heritage and nature conservation objectives must include the language of injustice, discrimination, inequity, and racism in discussions to acknowledge the continuing struggle to totally dismantle these conditions, which in more places than many may want to recognize, continue inhibiting communities of color from full civic participation, human experiences, and civil society entitlements. As part of the California Coastal Commission's policy mandate, the city of Santa Monica was asked to develop an education program to teach the public about the history of the African Americans who lived and worked in the South Beach neighborhoods near the Civic Center area in the coastal zone prior to the expansion and other related waves of urban renewal projects that displaced this community before 1960 as part of the new historic, as part of the new historic Belmar Park construction plan. I was invited to contribute to this programming as the project historian. The programming, Belmar History Plus Art, is a multifaceted education, inspirational, and remembrance project that includes a context essay that I wrote, an outdoor exhibition installation of interpretive history panels, interpretive history text panels, which I also wrote, and a large sculpture. Programming also includes grade school lesson plans and other educational activities, including a website and a high school student art project that will bring this area's history to life for present and future generations. Here again, I've drawn on my research to guide and enrich this public program in Santa Monica's, this public program. And it's loaded with historical, this Santa Monica program that's loaded with historical significance as well as contemporary consequences. As the nation and the world are grappling simultaneously with a pandemic and a reinvigorated longing for racial equality and Black dignity and citizenship, the Belmar History plus Art Project is timely as a contribution to this dialogue, as it helps open and inform contemporary life for understanding of those who came before us in Santa Monica's historical African-American community life. It helps build a broader, richer, and more accurate understanding of our shared history and identity in our global, national, regional, and local citizenship. The public commemoration of the Santa Monica Bay historical African-American coastal zone sites I have discussed today, and other similar sites throughout California and the nation, open the door towards social and environmental justice by recognizing that communities of color have a right to historical and cultural sites, along with clean air and water, and the enjoyment of America's natural and other resources. In closing, like many white Americans, Black Americans were lured to California for its opportunities and the good life imagery produced by writers, painters, photographers, and movie makers, which were used by various boosters promoting migration to the state, The stories and imagery of African Americans who participated in various phases of the Western migration and settlement continue to remain largely absent from the dominant mythologies and history surrounding the westward migration, notwithstanding investigations of the Black West published during the last 50 years. Today, I've briefly highlighted little-known stories about African Americans' agency and socioeconomic investment in the California dream lifestyle at what have been called frontier of leisure destinations in Southern California from the 1900s to the 1960s. As well as the intersection of the intersection of the stories in my book and the public process activities I have discussed for education, remembrance of our collective heritage, cultural identity, and stewardship action offer new ways to connect people with nature, with natural, cultural, and historical heritage, and encourage visitation to these locations and others around the US. As a historian, I have and will continue to firmly engage in encouraging people to use history for these broader educational programs for wider equity and access for all people for enjoyment of the California coastline and other American cultural and natural places now and in the future. So I hope that you will take time to learn more about these forgotten Black Western pioneers and their undertakings, and ponder the implications of their stories for our lives today by buying my book and reading it. Thank you.